Now, Sarah, you've been researching in a much more, I mean, in some ways, more traditional sort of area of black politics, haven't you?
Yeah, thanks, Julianne. And before I start, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're on today, the Gadigal people, and to pay my respects to elders past and present. And also, I guess, as all the speakers on the panel today have done, to acknowledge the strength, the resilience and the capacity of Indigenous people in Australia, which is something that just doesn't happen very often in our mainstream politics. My book is based on a series of interviews with a group of people who I describe in a fairly clunky way as leaders and activists. It's clunky because when I first started writing, my research in the past has all been in the area of social movements, and I use the term activist very broadly to mean those people on the front lines of a protest and those people in the back room stuffing envelopes. But it became very clear to me that a lot of Aboriginal people were very uncomfortable being described as activists. But leadership is also a very difficult term to use, and it touches on what Wesley was just saying about confidence, something I ended up writing about quite a bit in the book. It came through very strongly in my interviews that there is a real fear among a lot of Aboriginal people that success means being lost to the culture. Someone talks about crabs in the bucket, that if you get out of that bucket, if you succeed in the mainstream, you might somehow be lost to your people. And that's a real fear, and that causes a sort of resistance to success that I think is part and parcel of the issues that you're raising. So I think that's one of the complexities that I touch on in the book, and it is very complex. And I hope you all read it, and, of course. But I guess one of the things that I wanted to talk about today in terms of engagement, which is the theme of today, has been the non-Indigenous response to the work that I'm doing, or the work that I was doing. And I write about this a little bit in the introduction to the book. The response from Aboriginal people, and one of my interviewees, John Maynard, is in the audience today, and he typifies this, was one of welcome, encouragement, support, engagement in a very genuine sense, people making time for me in busy schedules, picking me up from airports, taking me to their homes and communities, feeding me, really being very generous. Because, as a number of them said, I think it's great that you're doing this work. I know that it's been confronting for some people who've participated in the project, and other people who've read the book since. Megan and I were having an email exchange about it the other day. She said, it's interesting to have a mirror held up, and I recognise that. But that's all been, with a few notable exceptions, conducted in a very mutually respectful and engaged way, in a discussion about political culture, political community, the implications of that for us all as a nation. The non-Indigenous response has been quite different. Almost uniformly, the response from non-Indigenous people has been to say, "How brave. How brave that you're doing that work." And I think that says a lot about us, really. And I suppose I have to contrast it with the fact that my previous book was called Silencing Dissent, and it was a fairly full-on attack of the government of the day, particularly around the silencing tactics that they were using for people who were being critical of them, i.e. me. Nobody said that was brave. Nobody said, "Oh, you're taking on John Howard, that's brave." Nobody said that. Here I am seeking a respectful engagement with Aboriginal leaders and activists around their understandings of their politics. Well, that's so brave. And I think that speaks volumes about where we are at as a nation in terms of our terms of engagement. And I think that, coming back to what Megan was saying about a new representative body, and coming back to Wesley's question about where Aboriginal people might be in 30 years, a lot of that answer has to rest with white people, with non-Indigenous people, with our ability to step back, with our ability to truly grasp that 70% of Aboriginal people live in cities and towns, that they're not this exotic other out there in the bush, that we can engage with that. We can engage with traditional Aboriginal culture and we can demonise it, because that's not really us. That doesn't really affect us where we live. We can have that over there and not actually change anything about ourselves. And I think that's what Aboriginal people, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people need non-Indigenous people to do right now and to do for the next 30 years and to do in order to enable a representative body to have real legitimacy and to be sustainable and to create that virtual Indigenous state. We need to shift. We need to unsettle ourselves. We need to stop being afraid of Aboriginal people, and in unsettling ourselves and recognising both the harms that were done in the past and the contemporary ramifications of that, and supporting Aboriginal people in their struggles and their desire to be truly self-determining, we need to experience a bit of pain and discomfort. Wesley's work has been profound for me in some of that, as I remember seeing the stages of grieving production and being unable to get out of my seat for half an hour afterwards. I found it profoundly moving. Samson and Delilah had a similar effect on me more recently. I think a lot of non-Indigenous people shy away from that. It is painful to confront what the colonisation of this country has done to Indigenous, the original inhabitants, to our First Nations people. It is painful for us. We need to sit with that pain a little bit. We need to not keep deferring the resolution to that question as a nation. We need to revive a process of dialogue towards some more fundamental resolution, whether it's about sovereignty, whether it's about constitutional reform, whether it's about revisiting the question of a treaty. For me, all of those things must prefigure any opportunity that we have to get the broader policy settings right. We can't do that in this context. We can't do that as a nation. We can't make policy for Aboriginal people while we're frightened of Aboriginal people, while we're unable to sit with that pain and to move through that in an engaged way. So I'll leave it there.
So we've got four quite different sort of pinpricks, in a sense, of this very complex mosaic of ways of engaging, ways of participating, and I'm sort of struggling a bit to try to think how to pull these bits together. One of the things that strikes me is that sort of openness to new ways of seeing and thinking about the sort of issues. I mean, which is common to us all. I mean, whether you're in any of our different positions. I mean, there needs to be an openness to new ways of engagement. And I'm not sure how you. I'd be interested in how each of you see pathways towards getting there. I mean, Wesley, you're nodding most vigorously. You've got some ideas on how this might happen.
No, it's all for show. I think that ultimately it's about interrogation. And I use the word interrogation because it is about taking these images, these myths, these romantic notions of Aboriginality that I think also as Aboriginal people we are holding on to. We're holding on to these romantic notions because they have currency in a broader society. How do we actually take these notions and actually interrogate them, ask questions of them and make them choices rather than just default positions? How to do that, I think, is these kind of forums are part of it. But I was part of a discussion recently. There were 10 Indigenous artists and arts educators, and we were sitting around talking about this particular thing, and ultimately it just kept coming back to sovereignty. Kept coming back to, how in this system, capitalism may leave us behind, but if in fact we acknowledge through either a treaty or a series of treaties or some form of sovereignty, the kind of economic kind of power that has, a lot of those decisions will start to define themselves, I think, too. A lot of those positions will start to define themselves as we have to articulate ourselves. I mean, I'm a bit kind of iffy about the native title process at the moment because I'm not a great fan of anthropology. But there is a sense of having to know where you come from and articulate that, which means that it does build this cultural capital a lot too. To take that cultural capital and then interrogate it further, be it through just intellectual stuff or actually putting it out there in front of people without the kind of romantic, I could sing you a welcome song now because we all know one, but there's a sense of, do I understand enough of where it comes from and where it belongs and what choices we want to make and all those kind of things around it.
I just wanted to make the point, since the abolition of ATSIC, it's been rare moments when large groups of people from around the country have been able to get together and speak. And I think at the 2020 summit in the Indigenous stream, and especially at the Adelaide representative body meeting in Adelaide, I was really surprised that everybody, and there hadn't been any caucusing or organising of positions or anything like that. And in fact, at the 2020 summit, I thought we were the most unorganised stream. There hadn't been much politicking behind the scenes beforehand, unlike a lot of the other streams. But the big issue was unfinished business and sovereignty and issues of that, and it always comes back to that. And that hasn't changed. And I know at 2020 you got the sense that the government was a bit frustrated about that because I think they thought Indigenous politics has moved on. They've put to bed all this, silly stuff about treaty and sovereignty, but it hasn't. It's just as I think relevant and has even more currency now than it ever has. And I think in terms of what you were talking about, cultural myths and these things that we internalise in the community, these narratives about ourselves that I think sometimes limit ourselves and certainly has an enormous impact on your confidence to then walk out into the broader world and participate in discussions about Indigenous politics and non-Indigenous politics. I think until these issues are addressed, it's really going to be a major blocking point in terms of moving forward.
I think politically there's been a lot of pressure to have a very united front, over the last 40 years for any kind of political change. So as Indigenous people from all around the country, from lots of different backgrounds, there's always been this sense of centralise and make a push together. And what I think we're seeing more and more is how diverse Indigenous Australia is, and that diversity now is seen as a weakness. And all of this stuff about, and this is going to sound heretical, but the sense of saying education and health and housing, employment is not important is not actually what I'm saying, but that if we go back to some of the root causes, that would be more important. And I think that the paradigm of disadvantage has been the dominant paradigm for 40 years. And that's why I think treaty has always been able to be pushed to the side, because ideas of practical reconciliation and the kind of emotional and sentimental pulls that, when you can say, well, my family die much younger than your family, that's kind of quite emotional. But to somehow try to grapple with the cultural needs and the cultural sense of why we do things, which always lead us back to sovereignty, is hugely problematic in the discourse.
Go on.
I think we also need to look at what happened in that ATSIC void when there was no national representative body. A couple of figures, and I can't help but notice the Noel Pearson book sitting there, Julianne, rushed to fill that void. And that, I think, has been enormously problematic. It comes through very clearly in the interviews that I conducted and in the book that Noel Pearson is a very marginal figure to the broader Indigenous polity in Australia. And when I hear people like Noel's colleague Marcia Langton say things like children can't eat the Constitution, I think, well, I guess what Wesley's saying is, yeah, they can, and actually, if we don't start dishing up some constitutional reform, in 30 years Aboriginal children are still going to be going cap in hand and saying, please, sir, can I have some more? And I think that sidelining of, so-called symbolic politics or symbolic reconciliation that we allowed John Howard to get away with has left a very long legacy. And we can't assume that because there's been a change of government that mindset has gone away. It absolutely has not. We are still working very much in that framework, and I think that poses a very dangerous challenge for the new rep body that will emerge later this year.
Sorry, I think it does, and certainly when you think about the Howard years, I was about to say. in the Howard years, Noel Pearson did fill a void, but a lot of people went home too. A lot of people hung up their boots and left for the Howard years because they felt like you'd be, you know, what's the expression, hitting your head against the brick wall.
Hang around for a kick in the head.
And that's problematic too, because that means we run our politics and in such a polemic and politicised way that at the moment you get this Conservative government, who, mind you, I'm not saying weren't just absolutely appalling when it come to Indigenous issues, but in terms of constitutional reform and moving forward and engaging white Australia, the only way you ever change the Constitution is by having half of the Australian population. The only way you'll ever get any traction in terms of these big picture unfinished business stuff that we want is that, you know, you need bipartisan support, you need the Conservatives, and you know, and I think that's I think it's true. Noel stood in, but a lot of us just disappeared too for the Howard era, and I think that's, you know, I think that was really problematic in the way in which we do business, you know, in terms of at that national political level.
Yeah. I think it's very easy to forget some of the hideous things that have happened, like getting rid of you know, the whole native title process is a scandal, I think, the way so much is promised, so little is delivered, it's so expensive, it is so painful for people to have to prove all sorts of things. I think these kind of scandals are not well understood, and I actually think we anthropologists, thinkers, whoever, need to understand ourselves. It's the white culture that dominates here. I mean, let's face it. There's a brute fact of Aboriginal population being 2%, is it? What is it now?
2.5.
Very well.
About 500,000.
That is a pretty brute fact in the political world, of course. And it seems to me that what's happened, you know, there is a facade of goodwill, and one of the things I'm now looking at in Mount Druitt is actually that facade, the sentimental politics that is so apparent in various institutions where you get lip service paid to Indigenous people. And I actually find even the acknowledgement of country now quite difficult, because I've heard it done in circumstances where it appears so hypocritical that it makes anyone cringe. And yet I think that is the kind of public sympathy, the public sense of, you know, we're terribly guilty about the history. We're guilty. We want Aboriginal people to be better off. We want them to we want their problems solved. But the way it's happening, and why I quoted Barney there, is that some of the things that are happening in the name of teaching people their culture are really quite bizarre and problematic. And so I think there is a conversation. The nation, I think, has to be a little more honest with itself about the way we engage with these things, and engaging with actual people. And I mean, the Noel Pearson phenomena, it seems to me astonishing. I think he was one of the most brilliant thinkers about the Aboriginal political condition at the time when he did make these breakthroughs and very systematically put in place a very sort of well thought out, thorough process to engage big business, to engage the right wing of our nation in improving Aboriginal conditions. Now, he did a lot of work there. When they put the Northern Territory emergency in place, that was like a cheap copy, it seemed to me. They took some of the ideas and plonked it in without very much thought or care or sensitivity.
10 years earlier, the Howard government took almost $1 billion out of Indigenous affairs, and 10 years later, you know, he put just under $1 billion into the intervention in Northern Territory. I think they're kind of related.
Let's talk about the money for a minute, because I think this is an area where that just needs to be exposed for what it is. You know, we're always talking about the billions of dollars being poured into Indigenous affairs. And I was in the Northern Territory the other week when the Territory budget was brought down, and someone was explaining to me the way in which that budget is calculated, which includes adding up how many Aboriginal people are in the Northern Territory jails and dividing so that component of the criminal justice budget is counted under Aboriginal affairs. How many Aboriginal people are in hospital? Well, that includes part of the health budget. And then, of course, all the money that's been used to fight native title claims, to fight land rights claims. This is also counted in the Indigenous Affairs budget. So, I just want to take that opportunity to debunk that little myth for a moment about what's actually going on.
But one of the things that's interesting in that is that the measuring of outcomes is actually much, there's not the same rigour applied to the measuring of outcomes. So not only is there fudging about the monies, but there's measuring of outcomes is also done in a very sort of, on the one hand, on the other, it's not clear. And I mean, that's their points that Marcia Langton especially has documented extremely well in terms of, the outcomes of that money that's being spent, especially in the Northern Territory.
That's the concern about the closing the gap statement. If you go through it, I mean, these targets are just so amorphous, and there's no methodology that underpins, and it's all about, again, I don't know how I mean, I guess governments deliberately design things like that, so that
it gives them fudge room. I think
it's fantastic that there's because I work in arts and cultural stuff, that there's a huge amount of money going into arts and cultural development, massive amounts of money, and most of it's tourist dollars, tourist oriented. That 72% of all international visitors to Australia want to have an experience of Indigenous Australia, and that fuels the government policy, which is about how can these tourists access that. So this money goes into developing dance groups in small towns and whatever.
There's several in Mount Druitt.
Several in Mount Druitt, excellent. And there's this kind of sense that, again, the discussion is not cultural, it's economic. And I had this, at this meeting we were at, where we were talking about arts funding and stuff like that, and up again it comes, arts funding or cultural work is in fact about employment opportunities for Indigenous Australians. Look, sure, that's kind of a byproduct of what is and should be a much broader and more important cultural debate about the work itself.
But what are the sorry, just one more quick point, Julianne. Sorry. What are the outcomes of that kind of fudging of budgets and fudging of outcomes? Is we then are allowed to develop a rhetoric around emergency, around the need for a crisis intervention, about the rhetoric around, well, the old approaches haven't worked. I think that there's a whole lot more forensic scrutiny that needs to be applied to that whole framework over the last 30 years.
Can I ask you something? When people said how brave about your research, I mean, it seems to me our duty is to understand what they meant. What do you think they meant?
Well, that's a very good question, and that's actually going to be my next book, I hope. And my thinking of it is in the very early stages, but I think you've mentioned guilt. A few people have mentioned guilt a few times, and I think that's where it comes from, that we allow ourselves... I think guilt is a really appropriate response. I think that there's a lot that non-Indigenous Australia ought to feel guilty about in terms of our continued ability to profit from the dispossession of Aboriginal people from their lands. That is still a fairly recent event. We're still a very young country. It's not that long ago. But we don't know what to do with the guilt. And I think that's where the fear comes from. We feel so uncomfortable. We don't know what to do with it. We either externalise that as some form of aggression or racism or hatred to Aboriginal people for making us feel that way, or we internalise that and we get stuck and we take that burden to Aboriginal people and we say, help me, I feel so guilty. What can I do? What can I do to help you?
But that's surely the point of a lot of Noel's thinking, that Noel Pearson's thinking on that is that internalisation of victimhood is actually a part of the problem that occurs. And I mean, I know that he's by being out there, that's alienated a lot of people. But I mean, I think it's unfortunate to dismiss the serious thinking and serious work that he's been doing, as something which is controversial and unliked and and so on. I mean, what he has been trying to do, and I've spoken to him a lot about this over the years, is really trying to find a way that connects not with the people who've already bought the arguments about Indigenous rights and access and belonging and so on, but to make arguments which connect with different parts of the Australian community, and also at the same time to be really addressing that sort of question of both cultural belonging but also economic sustainability. Now that's tricky territory. That's not something that you can do very easily. It happens at that part of North Queensland, you can sort of draw a line and demark it as a part, but you don't get that capacity to do in Western Sydney. You don't get that capacity to do on Stradbroke Island. You don't get that capacity to do in other parts of Australia with quite the same clarity. Now, it's sort of out there, but I think it's really important that those issues get addressed rather than being put to one side as being controversial or difficult or, attending a neoliberal agenda or, whatever the sort of jargon is that's used around them.
I was just going to say, I think it's at that point where, he has this body of writing and he has this... do you want to hold up?
Yeah, I'll hold up the book. Yeah, I've done all the books, yeah.
But I think in terms of the Aboriginal community anyway, I think there's... people are waiting now to see the evidence base of how, what does this look like in practice, and I think that's kind of the point, the holding pattern that.
My feeling is not that Noel Pearson is right or wrong. He is of a community, and that he is working in that community, his own family and his own clan and his own kind of tribe, to make something work.
One of the things that sorry, you go on. I've got another question.
I was just going to add that I think the other aspect of the fear, though, the idea that you are being brave, is the fear of getting involved with Indigenous people who might be angry with you. And that brings me back to the violence that Megan mentioned. We haven't mentioned violence since then. And, of course, it's a very sensitive topic. But I must say in Mount Druitt, some of the violent people were the women. But violent in a way that was assertive and not necessarily destructive in my sense, in my view. I think there's a complexity to violence. It becomes an arena where there's this fear and distancing. And because Aboriginal people are outspoken, Aboriginal political leaders and politicians, Marcy's a lovely example, very outspoken, very upfront, doesn't hold back. I think that's probably why you were considered brave, entering that fray. But that upfrontness and courage, I think, is an interesting sort of counterpoint to what you were saying, Wesley, about the need to have confidence. Because in a certain sense, the people in Mount Druitt were confident at home in their very limited arena and were afraid of moving out into the big wide world.
One of you mentioned before that sort of favourite wounded subjects sort of...
Well,
yes. And I don't know, Megan, is there something you want to say more about the sort of violence and...
No.
You've Wesley?
This is kind of off the point a little bit. There is this thing, I was told once that there was the term for white people in a particular community is white meat, that you eat off it. You eat from them because you can trade in the guilt for things that you can survive on, and it's really important to kind of keep thinking that it's a two-sided kind of exchange here. Aboriginal people are as much I take responsibility for it. I know I trade on the white guilt as much as I try to push it away as well, because you know that it gives you a platform to speak from. And I just wanted to make this quick little connection, because I know we're running out of time, but the whole idea that... I was just reading Jung recently, and that whole idea of...
The theatre director.
Just on the spare time. But that whole idea that, in some respects, the shadow of this country is its Aboriginal history, and and that there's a lot of subconscious and psychological energy put into an image of Aboriginal Australia which may not be the truth, that it's better to go face it and tell the story of it than let it grow and kind of become this thing that will shadow you for the rest of, our lives in some respects, and that the adolescence of this country, the maturing of it will be about dealing with those kind of things in a very, very visceral way, the kind of the pain, the anguish, but also for Aboriginal Australia to, try to get ourselves off the drip of white guilt.
Yeah, it's. I mean, I'm not. I'm not a Catholic, but I think the term original sin kind of captures it well, and that both black and white Australia are seeking some sort of absolution through confession, that seems to permanently escape us.
One of the things, I mean, and I think, Wesley, you're right about the sort of adolescence. I mean, I think there's an adolescence about the way this country works, and I think it's there apparent in the relations with Indigenous people, but I think it's also apparent in the sort of multicultural stuff as well. You know, there's a sort of, we've got an old model of what it means to be Australian, which was, you know, which I guess was really formed in recent times. You know, was formed in rejection of the sort of cultural cringe and not being British, not being American. You know, we're somehow this sort of Australia that's developed as this sort of, you know, the sort of the ochre, but with a bit more of an edge, you know. And in fact, while that might have worked quite nicely in a sort of 60s, 70s sort of environment to create a definition of what it meant to be Australian, Australia in 2000 and whatever we are now, 2009, is a profoundly different place. And we actually don't have, I don't think, the sort of national senses of self-definition which adequately take in where we've travelled in that sort of 30-year period. And so that picks up all the sort of multicultural stuff. It's the news thinking about Indigenous engagement. It's the sort of whole questions of sustainability and so on. And so that's the Australia that the best of Australia as it is now seems to me to be something which is outward looking, it's very engaged, it's very diverse, it's very global in its worldview. But when you try and get a snapshot of what it means to be Australian, we still don't have the right language for that. And so it seems to me very much that these sorts of conversations about terms of engagements with Indigenous people and the conversations that we have in other areas are about trying to find what this new definition of who we are is in a sort of shorthand that will make sense for the next little while. It's that sort of future storytelling that you were referring to. All right, well, look, we're going to have to leave it there. I'm sure that I think both Gillian and Sarah will be available to sign their books down in the bookshop, so if you want to continue the conversation, I'm sure they'll be happy to do so. Thank you for being here, and I hope you can...